The Last of Us Left Behind was originally a paid single-player DLC for the PlayStation 3 version of the game, which was eventually bundled together with the main game for the remastered PS4 version. In Left Behind, you play as Ellie, with the game taking place over two different time periods. The first being just after the university section of the game, when Joel gets injured and Ellie has to carry him out on a horseback. You find out just what exactly happened right after that point, because in the main game it sort of jumps ahead a bit, with Ellie being on her own for a while. You also get another section of the game which fills in some blanks about Ellie's past, as she has an encounter with Riley that has disastrous consequences. But is the game any good? Well, let's find out and see what's good and what's bad with The Last of Us Left Behind in today's review on Super Beanie-man Gaming for The Last of Us month.
I'll be back in a flash. Promise.
One of the cool things about this piece of DLC is the story itself and how it takes place in the present right after Joel hurts himself, and in the past via flashbacks with Ellie and Riley. In the main game, you never saw what actually happened immediately after Joel was injured at the university, but it never felt like it was deliberately left out for some DLC, so it's nice to see them explore that here as we play as Ellie, who is now getting more and more battle-hardened after experiences with David's camp. So you see her in a shopping mall, surviving on her own with no ammo or supplies, desperately searching for some medical equipment in order to patch up Joel's wounds and save his life. This is in sharp contrast to the flashback scenes, which also deliberately take place in a similar shopping mall location, whereas here we see a more carefree, younger, spirited Ellie as she goes on a sort of kiddie sort of adventure, trespassing in a location with Riley, just having fun and generally being a kid. So it's a nice balance between the more serious Ellie and the more carefree, innocent Ellie. It's a really interesting way of adding some extra bits of story to the game, and I really liked what they did with it. I feel like the game does a great job of switching back and forth between the two parts of the story, as this will happen quite often as you're playing through. You'll usually get to a big point in one of the timelines, and it will sort of leave it on a mini sort of cliffhanger, though it never feels like you're forced to go back to the boring part, as both storylines do a great job of balancing it and keeping things interested, so you're always wanting to carry on the story to see what happens in both, because both are always fun. Another cool bit I liked was that you get to see more of what life is like in a military zone during the flashbacks, as you get to wander around sort of the city a bit and see things going on and hear things. It also ties nicely into the American Dreams comic book, as it references a character called Winston, which is in that book, so that's quite a nice touch. Overall, it's a really cool and interesting story that will keep you gripped throughout. One of the biggest problems with Left Behind is its length, as unfortunately the DLC is really short, clocking in at probably around 2 to 2.5 hours for your first playthrough, and to be honest, that's not very good at all really, especially considering this was quite pricey when it first came out. However, there are multiple difficulties for you to pick, so I would recommend going through it on at least hard or higher, just to make it last a bit longer, as the encounters will probably be a bit more tricky, so you might have to restart them a couple of times. To give it a bit of replayability, there are a few collectibles for you to grab along the way. There are also some optional dialogue choices and optional dialogue conversations that you can have with Riley throughout that will give you some sense of difference when you play through again. The attempts to offer those multiple paths, though, aren't that great. You can win a minigame or you can lose a minigame. They don't really amount to anything major other than just a single line of dialogue changing after the fact. It doesn't really affect the overall story. So Left Behind is kind of a probably for most people a one and done sort of piece of content. It's not something that you'll come back to again and again unless you're like a massive fan of the series like me. You probably will just play through this once and that'll be enough for you. It's just a shame that what's there is good, but it's just short, and that's the biggest complaint I have with it. The mall in the winter section of Left Behind brings back some creepy and sort of horror themes back into The Last of Us, which is really appreciated. It's a great part of the game, as Ellie starts out with no ammo in her pistol and she has no other supplies in her inventory, so you're in a really vulnerable state to begin with. As you explore this unknown location, you eventually run into some more clickers throughout the mall, so you're in a really desperate situation as you try and find anything just to help you survive against them. As you go through the story, you get to explore some really cool stores and locations within the mall, such as a creepy doll shop which has its own jump scares, which is quite a nice touch. There's a couple of these little jump scares scattered throughout the game. One in particular I thought was really cool. It involved a cat that scares Ellie as well as you if you're really into it with headphones on. The horror element also extends to some of the battle areas, as the whole game in the mall is pretty much really dark, so you're always using your flashlight, which eventually will run out, and you have to avoid certain rooms with clickers in, which harkens back to that cool room in the main game. Overall, it's a quite nerve-wracking experience going through this part, and it's done really well. It's good to see horror back in The Last of Us. One of the new gameplay elements Left Behind introduces is dialogue choices, and now I'm not talking about those triangle optional conversation prompts that were also in the main game. No, these are more Mass Effect style character dialogue choices that come up throughout the game. There's not many of them, but I just don't think they worked very well, and they just seemed really out of place. Whichever option you pick for this like bottle one, it doesn't really change any outcome to the story. You just get a small variant of this scene, and it never really amounts to anything interesting. I just don't see why they were put in. They just didn't really work for me. I didn't really think they were needed. Another element I didn't like was the abundance of QTEs in this DLC, and one of the worst ones for me that just felt really gamey and sort of tacked on was the roar meter in the fancy dress shop, where you have to mash triangle in order for Ellie to do a really loud roar. While it was fun in context of the story, it just felt really cheap in terms of gameplay, and it kind of took me out of the story a bit and made me realise that it was a game, and it just felt really tacked on, that part. Introducing a character like Riley, who was only briefly mentioned in the main game, and tying so much of the DLC's story and gameplay around her was quite a big gamble by Naughty Dog, but I have to say it paid off greatly, as the character interactions and relationship between Ellie and Riley is perhaps the strongest thing of this DLC. The characters meet up again after a long absence, and it's clear that things have been left unsettled between them, as their relationship initially is quite frosty. As they both enter the mall and begin to have fun, their relationship changes, and they seem to go back to their old carefree, fun way with each other, as they share a lot of laughs and a lot of fun things happen to them while they're in the mall. You can see through these moments that these characters are really good friends and they care about each other quite a lot, but underneath all the laughter on the surface, there's a lot of sadness between the two, that their feelings sort of go unsaid a lot of times throughout the game. You can tell that they kind of want to say something to each other, but they never quite have the courage or the words to get it out and say what they mean. As they begin to have fun, it's not long before their tension and unresolved issues come back to the surface, and they eventually fall out and have a few arguments along the way. I won't spoil too much of what happens at the end, but this relationship is really cool, and it's a great bit of the story.
Go check out this music.
For those players wanting more of the excellent gunplay and scavenging for the main game, you may be kind of disappointed with this DLC, as it's not very combat heavy at all. There's only about 3 or so battles that you actually get a big gunfight in, But the majority of these appear at the end of the game, and you only really have the pistol and the bow for the majority of it. So you never really get to have a really big arsenal of weapons to have a really fun and interesting gunfight. I feel that they were kind of restricted with this due to the story and where it actually takes place in the timeline, because Ellie can't have all the weapons at this stage because she doesn't have them in the main game, and she can't be this gun-toting badass here because she's only just sort of becoming that in the main story, if that makes sense. So it is a shame that there's just not that much of the gunplay and shooting and cover-based mechanics that we love from the main game, because that was one of the really fun bits of the main game itself, and you only get to do it in fleeting short bursts here. The biggest battle comes probably at the end when you're trying to get back to Joel, who's locked in one of the shops and there's a load of human enemies around. That really is probably the best fight in the game, and even that one's over quite quickly, as it's just probably like 10 enemies and then another 10 after that. It definitely leaves you wanting more, and for those who just want an action heavy slice of DLC, this really isn't for you. The majority of the flashback sections offer a nice contrast to the more serious and desperate and tense winter section, as Ellie just gets to be a kid for a brief moment here and just have fun. And these sections are just really well done, from the animations, the way Riley would walk and balance on that ledge, to just their general jokes. They take the piss out of each other, they get themselves into trouble and they laugh about it, they play pranks on each other in the fancy dress shop, they have a lot of fun wearing the different masks, and it's just really cool to just see these characters just have a bit of fun. They also get into more mischief by throwing the bricks at the cars to smash the windows, and they play a little game of who can destroy the windows first, which you get to act out in. You then find a Ferris wheel and get to have a ride on that, as well as telling each other jokes with the no pun intended joke book. There's a lot of fun things to sort of do and take part in this DLC, and it's really cool to see some of it and just how they have fun with each other. There's also a really nice bit where they mock the voice Tannoy woman, and when Ellie gets on an escalator that works for the first time, and she's really loving it that it just takes her up without moving. And then when you get to the arcade and they play the games in there's just a lot of fun stuff. It reminds me of like kids in Stranger Things or Goonies or something like that, or Stand By Me, in just all the fun things they get up to before the big serious stuff goes down, and they're just really fun things to do. So, upon getting to the arcade in my first playthrough of Left Behind, I was really excited to go into it and explore, to see what cabinets were actually working and if we could actually play any of the games in there. And unfortunately, the DLC disappoints us twice. The first being the Jack X combat racing game that you don't actually get to play. Instead, Ellie just pretends she's sitting in a car driving, making the sound effects. The second is the turning cabinet, which we should have known better anyway, because Ellie mentioned in the main game that she's never got to play this game with Angel Knives. So we obviously knew we wouldn't get to play it, but the game does sort of let you play it, as Ellie imagines she's playing it with Riley telling her what's going on screen, and you then have to press the button prompts that appear on screen to mimic the fight. It's a cool little sequence, but it is a shame that you don't actually get to play any of the actual games in that arcade. Here's hoping in Last of Us Part 2 we'll finally find a working arcade machine so Ellie can finally play the turning for real, and we can actually see how bloody and gory Angel Knives moves are. Here's hoping, eh?
You win.
Fuck yeah, I win.
Not bad for your first game.
The generator room in Left Behind is hands down my favourite section of the winter part of the game, as it reminds me of two brilliant areas from the main game. The hotel section, where you have to power up the generator, and once you do, the sound alerts a load of infected and a bloater. And that area in the downtown section as you come out of the building and you're in a room full of clickers. It's a mixture of those two parts, and it's really cool. So the aim is to fill up a jerry can of fuel from the nearby cars and trucks in order for you to pour it into the generator and power it so you can open a nearby door. However, as you explore this flooded area in the dark, you notice that there are a load of stalker enemies in this vicinity. Now, if these see you, they will run at you and try and kill you. So it's not a brilliant clicker battle like before where one move and you're dead. But it is really intense because these fuckers will just run at you and charge. And if you're playing on some of the harder difficulties, you'll have a lot more of them in the room and the battle's even more intense. You could try and sneak through it, and I'm not sure if you could stealth all the way through it because they'll definitely hear you when you power on the generator. So you will have to fight them at some point. There's also there's also one little puzzle in this section once you've powered on the generator, as once you do that, it ends up electrocuting the water, so you can't walk to where the door is, you have to find another route through it. So this involves climbing up the trucks and climbing onto the vents that are running across the sort of higher ceiling part of the room. Eventually you have to drop down, and it's here where you have a little puzzle in that you need to put this trolley thing underneath a shutter, so when you jump onto the shutter it doesn't fall down, allowing you to walk across it as a sort of makeshift bridge. This is a really cool section. It has that horror element, it has an action element, and it has lots of tense and drama filled sections to it. It's a really cool section of the game and I really did enjoy it. While this wasn't specifically a problem for me, I do need to point out that the flashback sections with Riley are very story heavy, which is great for an initial playthrough as you're soaking it all in and you're enjoying it as you go along. However, when you look back at it, or you maybe play through the DLC again, you'll begin to realise that you don't really have that much amazing gameplay in this section, as it is mostly just walking and talking. I mean, sure, there are a few mini-games scattered about, like the car bricking one, the water fight, or bits in the arcade, etc. But it's mainly just walking and having them talk and watch the story unfold for this half of the DLC. It's kind of like, almost in a way, like The Walking Dead final season, or maybe Life is Strange and those sort of games where you just sort of taking part in that story but not really doing a great deal in terms of gameplay. There's no real enemies to fight here, there's no real puzzles to solve, it's more just walk along and every now and then press triangle to interact with something. The game though, and the DLC in particular, is lucky that the story is just so good and interesting that this won't really matter to most people. But I do know that some people will be put off by this aspect of it, because not everyone just wants to have the story. People want that gun-toting action gameplay and not necessarily this, which is why I'm putting this as a negative, even though it doesn't really bother me that much. Can you believe that in the entirety of the main campaign for Last of Us, you were never ever in a situation where the infected and human enemies such as hunters or the military are in the same room with you, in a fight with you? No? Neither could I, to be honest. In fact, after all of my playthroughs on the PS3 version, it never actually dawned on me that this was the case until I played the Left Behind DLC and realised. And fuck me, what a shame this wasn't in the main game, as these sections are really cool. So there are two main areas in the winter section of the game where both enemy types are in the same area, and they also do show up partway through the final battle of the game. And what's fun about these encounters with both sets of enemies is that you can play them off against each other, so you don't always have to fight them both. You can do things like throwing a bottle towards where the humans are, which will then lure over the clickers with the sound, and then you can just sit back and watch as these two fight each other, and then just pick off whoever manages to survive, whether it be a human or a clicker. This was really cool to see, and I hope they do more with this concept in the sequel, as it could be really interesting. You know, you could be you could be having a really intense firefight with a load of human enemies, and say maybe you blow up an exploding barrel or something else explodes, and this alerts a load of clickers, and then you're forced to fight alongside the humans to fend off this wave, and then fight the humans afterwards. There can be some really cool things to do here, and this lays the foundation for that. This flashback scene with Riley and Ellie dancing to the music is such a beautifully shot scene, and it's just really well done in general. The performances from both actors are really great here, and I really love the animations and character models that they're using in these cutscenes, because their expressions and emotions and feelings are really conveyed well here, and it's just such a great scene. The kiss itself doesn't feel forced or like a token scene to grab some headlines or anything like that, so props to Naughty Dog for doing really well with this. It's brilliant to see, and it culminates the whole journey that we've got on in this DLC to this point with these two characters, seeing their relationship finally blossom as they both admit their feelings for each other, and it's a cool scene. However, I do have one problem with this scene that I think kind of, in a way, ruins it, because I just think it's quite laughably bad, and it's when the zombies or infected, whatever you want to call them, hear and rush into the building, and you see this close-up shot of this guy as he turns. He just looks so stupid, and it always makes me laugh. It's just a weird sort of, he comes in, he's still, and then he turns and he growls. It's just dumb, really dumb. Now, anytime The Last of Us throws up rooms with clickers in that you need to try and sneak past, you always know that you're in for a pretty tense and fun, if nerve-wracking experience, and the Left Behind DLC doesn't disappoint in this regard, as you get a couple of areas where you have to get through past a bunch of clickers. This happens about halfway through the game, and it's a really fun section as you try and sneak your way through the several shops in order to open up the shutter to get back to where you were with that generator that will open the gate. So as you sneak through, you probably won't really have much ammo at this point, so your best option is to just sneak through, because fighting all these probably won't end well, especially on some of the higher difficulties. So, like in the main game, you'll need to scavenge around to try and find some bottles or bricks that you can throw to lure the clickers away. However, once you get to the end by the shutter, you'll find that there's one zombie just standing there. So you need to try and take him out silently so that the clickers nearby don't hear and rush towards him. You then get a nerve-wracking moment where you're trying to quickly press triangle as fast as you can to open that shutter before any of those clickers that you lured away return to their normal path near the shutter. It's just a great little section, and it's a shame there's not more, but what is there is definitely fun. So for those fans of Joel from The Last of Us, they'll probably be a bit disappointed to realise that he doesn't really feature much in this DLC, because, well, at this point in the story, he's kind of just really fucked up. So you won't be able to kick ass with Joel, shooting people and punching people to fucking death and stomping their heads into oblivion. So you will be disappointed if you're hoping to see much of Joel in this, because he's pretty much just lying on his ass throughout most of it. Another person that doesn't make an appearance in this DLC is the bloater enemy type. Unfortunately, you never get a big encounter with them, but again, this makes sense because in the story, Ellie doesn't see them until the gym bit in the high school. A fun little moment in the flashback scenes that I quite liked and thought was pretty cute was the photo booth section where the two girls find a working photo booth inside the mall. They venture inside not really knowing what it is, and they just sit and play around with it, and you get to play out a little sequence where you can pick various poses that the girls will do and pull various faces as each photo is taken, and it's quite a cute little scene that helps further their bond with each other. After you do about 4 pictures, the photo session is complete, and you get this nice little joke. Even though it's very product placement, there's a nice little joke with Facebook that I'll let play out now, which I think was pretty funny.
Great. What's a Facebook?
Maybe it prints our faces in a book? Enter user.
A common problem with most DLCs is that they can often feel like they're just recycling a lot of content and assets created for the main game in the DLC, and while Last of Us does an admirable job of making brand new locations, only losing the odd prop like a table or a cup or whatever, it does have a lot of brand new content, but an area where it lacks is the actual enemies and weapons that you use throughout the game. Unfortunately, there's no new enemy types to fight in this section, and you still use the same weapons that you have in the main game. You get the pistol, the bow, and briefly the hunting rifle, as well as the cocktail and the usual bombs that you can create in the main game, and it's quite a shame that there's nothing new, especially when you consider that the multiplayer had some brand new weapons created for DLC. We could have got them here, and it would have been fun to use them for a brief bit. Now, while I'll try and avoid major spoilers here to not spoil the actual ending, I have to say one of my final highlights of this game's DLC is the actual Left Behind ending, as I think it's a really powerful and an emotional ending. So there's two parts to the ending, the flashback bit with Riley and then the present day bit with Ellie and Joel. And I'll mainly show the Joel bit here because that's not too spoilery if you've played the main game anyway. So she eventually manages to find the first aid kit and the suture kit so she can patch up Joel's gaping hole from that pipe thing that got stuck into him. So she sort of manages to save his life at this point, and she then begins her journey through the winter section to where she would meet up with her in the main game, and that bit's a nice sort of ending to that part. But it's the Riley and Ellie bit that has the emotional weight to it and the real character driven parts to the ending, and it really does pack quite an emotional punch. And I like how the game ends the same sort of way that the main game ends, with a close-up shot of Ellie's face as she shows some emotion to whatever she's been dealing with. It's a really strong ending, I think, and it's as good as the main game's ending. So overall, I think Left Behind is a really good package, and while it was a bit pricey for a DLC on the PS3 given its short length, in the remastered collection it's a great little additional story to the main game. The game itself, while short, is a fun ride, and I do like how they split up the story into the present and past sections, and how they both interwoven in each other and contrasted with each other through the setting and characters. The story itself was really gripping, and the Riley-Ellie relationship was a definite strong point. There are a few flaws in the DLC, in that its length is quite short, and the flashback section is mostly just a walking, talking, sort of listening section, and not really a great deal of gameplay. But the present day bit caters for that part, and there are some great encounters and some new ideas introduced, such as having the humans and infected being in the same rooms at once, so you can have a three-way combat scenario, which is crazily not in the main game, and I hope they expand upon that sort of element of combat against both enemy types in Last of Us Part 2. There's some really cool ideas here, and there's lots of fun little mini games for you to do and take part in. However, I don't think it has a great amount of replay value to it, because some people will be put off by having to slowly walk through those conversation character moments that this DLC has quite a lot of. However, it's definitely a fun ride to play at least once or twice, and you'll definitely get your money's worth having it included with the PS4 version of the game. Overall, I would rate this a solid 8 out of 10, as it is a really cool additional piece of content to the game, and I hope Last of Us Part 2 has a similarly well made and well structured piece of DLC, and hopefully if that main game doesn't show much of Joel, we will at least get some fun DLC with him included at a later date. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you're enjoying Last of Us Month so far, and I will see you again tomorrow for another Last of Us themed video. Cheers. Bye.